Hi, and welcome to our discussion on the changing role of storytelling in the social impact sector. My name is Levis Nderitu. I'm the Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at PATH. During this conversation, we are going to explore how communication professionals can get their organizations on board to improve storytelling practices in order to influence program impact, deliver greater efficiency, and ultimately provide local actors and communities a seat at the decision making table. I'm joined by three incredible guests. Clare Spurrell is the Director of Strategy and Communication at Care International. Chilande Kuloba-Warria is the Founder and Managing Director at the Warrande Advisory Centre, an organizational development and technical support facility based in Nairobi, Kenya. And Victor Mark-Onyegbu is the Head of Grants at Africa No Filter, a donor collaborative that supports the development of nuanced and contemporary stories that shift stereotypical and harmful narratives within and about Africa. But I'm not doing it justice by introducing them, and so I will let them introduce themselves. So, Claire, go for it. Introduce yourself better than perhaps I did.
My name is Clare Spurrell. I work for Care International. I've been with Care for just over 7 years, and I'm really honoured and privileged to be invited into this space. So thank you very much for having me.
I'm Chilande Kuloba-Warria. I'm based here in Nairobi, running this technical support facility that tries to primarily, help organizations that work in development and humanitarian sector to be about more effective in delivering their service, but also to bridge the gap between them and those stakeholders that they need, mostly funders and the communities that they serve.
Victor Mark-Onyegbu, based in Lagos, Nigeria. I work for Africa No Filter, a donor collaborative whose aim is really to build and support the field of narrative change makers by supporting storytellers, investing in media platforms, and driving disruption. I head grants at African No Filter, which comprises grant making to the arts and culture sector and grant making in the media sector across Africa.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much for that. I'd like us to jump right in, and thank you very much. We are truly honored to really have you in this conversation. This will be interesting to just hear the different perspectives that each of you brings to this conversation. Will be fascinating. And you've all been advocating for a more respectful communications practices in your own work. What would you say is the most important reason why organizations should rethink the role of communications and storytelling at this time? And I would like to start with you, Chilande.
This conversation is long overdue.
Mm-hmm.
It's 2022. We are in an ecosystem where we all completely believe in the fact that, nothing about me without me. And core to that principle is how we represent each other and how we communicate, how we relate. Communication is at the center of all of that. Right now, it is very important that we rethink it, because somebody told me recently, they said, there's a lot of emphasis on trust building, but we need to think about trust is one thing as a principle, but then respect is how you show me that you trust me. And you respect me by valuing me, you respect me by valuing my story, by acknowledging my story, by hearing what I'm saying, and by inviting me to the table. And so it is important that organizations go back and rethink how are they demonstrating this trust? How are they demonstrating respect by how they relate and how they communicate? What stories are they telling? Who's telling that story? And all of that, so that we avoid the misrepresentation, we avoid the singular narratives that have been going on for so long, that have only represented people based on who's funding the narrative. So I'll just start off by saying that and allow colleagues also to chip in.
I love that, and I can't wait to build on that as well. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I agree very much with what Chilande is just saying. I think, now is the time, but arguably, it should have happened a long time ago. So I think that the points you were making there are very valid, particularly around there is a moral implication here, but it is about, basic respectful practices. I think some of one of the sort of critical, with bearing in mind the sort of the moral imperative, which is obviously extremely important for me, it's also about authenticity. So the reality, and apologies, I'm going to use a language that I don't particularly love, but when we talk about global north and global south, the reality in the sector is that much of the sort of storytelling, the fundraising, the communications, the media engagement is done and designed, or has been done and designed, in the global north. And I think regardless of, how, whether the best practices are intended with that, there has to be an acceptance that there is bias within that space. It's impossible to get to a truly authentic level of storytelling unless we really start rethinking some of those practices. So, this is about challenging some of the stereotypes we would have, for example, in a humanitarian disaster, where actually our experience at CARE is that within the communities that are struggling in one of the most undignified environments that you could find yourself in, there is a huge amount of strength. There is a huge amount of agency that is happening within that, but it's those stories that are often not being told. So, I think there is something here about, driving and constantly steering towards what is the authentic reality of a specific situation. And that requires a completely different way of doing. And but it's been, it's an interesting and an important journey for everybody to be going on. So yeah, it's great that we're having these conversations.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire. So already I'm hearing about trust building. I'm hearing about, authenticity. I'm hearing there is bias within the system. And we need to really tell the stories that reflected the communities that, these stories actually belong to. Victor, what are your perspectives? Why should we rethink how we tell our stories, and why now?
I totally agree with all that has been said already. I'll just simply add by saying that storytelling, we see storytelling as the most important medium through which institutions convey their presence, they convey their impact and their influence, how they influence their audiences towards their vision in the long term. And the reason why storytelling is so powerful is because stories allow audiences to connect on both an intellectual and emotional level. And we can all see that the world and the external environment within which institutions operate is in a constant state of flux. This is 2022. A lot has happened this year that could pass for an entire decade. Right. So the world is in a constant state of flux. The social environment is changing, and we operate within this social environment. Hence, the need to constantly examine the efficacy of our communication channels, our communication practices, our communication approaches, or we stand the risk of disconnecting from audiences and becoming irrelevant in the long run. So, it's really an imperative that we continue to think about the role of communication in storytelling, especially at a time as we find ourselves today.
Victor, thank you for that. I really love, when you talked about a connection. It's how we connect with these communities. It's how organizations convey their impact and influence. I think that's absolutely profound. And you use the word imperative, which I want to, delve into deeper. Do organizations have the moral imperative to actually tell better stories? I know much of the time we talk about a strong business case, right? And it's because of funding or whatever. But do they have a moral imperative to do this? And what is that moral imperative? Victor, I'll start with you because you used the word imperative. I'm being petty.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, the short answer is actually yes. I mean, that's the short answer to the question. They do have a moral imperative, and it's really, really obvious. So the short answer is yes. Although a more long winded answer would be that, like I said at the earlier question, stories allow audiences to connect emotionally and intellectually, right? And I believe it's such a powerful tool, and such an important tool needs to be deployed very carefully, responsibly, and ethically, as it could make or mar an institution, it could make or mar your target audiences or your environment of influence. The effects of stories over time, which are weaved together to form narratives, make it morally imperative to adopt ethical, balanced, and harmless communication approaches. So that's how I see that imperative. Stories, we define narratives as stories that have been told over time and it has come to be accepted. It becomes the narrative of a place or in the narrative of a people. So stories are extremely important, extremely powerful, and we can see what the benefits and the harmful effects that narratives could convey on the people. I mean, we we try to use the example of Africa and what narratives has done to the continent of Africa, the people of Africa over time, right? In the long run, we have seen what negative, stereotypical, harmful, stereotypical narratives have done to the continent of Africa. And the building blocks of narratives are actually stories. And so it's morally imperative because there's a huge consequence which you may not see from the story angle, but when you look at those stories being told over time and look at the narratives that have formed out of those stories that have been told over time, then it begins to dawn on you what the negative consequences of unbalanced stories, could be on the people and of a place and on a place. And so that's really how I would want to approach it.
Oh boy, I love that. I totally love that. I was like, I almost said amen to that. And I remembered I'm not in church. Chilande, do organizations have a moral imperative? And what is that moral imperative?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll stay in church of some sort. you know, um, if anything, if we're having this conversation just post this huge pandemic that just threw us all in a loop and reminded us of our basic humanity. And it reminded us of the fragility of humankind. And it reminded us, more importantly, of the interconnectedness of human beings. And that one thing that happens in one corner affects the whole. That in itself begins to give us the foundation for this moral imperative that we have. If we go back to both these versions of this statement, either in the spiritual realm, or if we go back to the basic concept of Ubuntu that we all have, connect with, I am because you are, right? And you take away my choice, you take away my will, you take away my soul by misrepresenting me in your stories and in your photos. And you cannot do that because we are all interconnected. The more we misrepresent, the more we hurt others. And as Victor has so eloquently put it, we are all one community that is connected in deeper ways than just that one thing that we have to put out there. We are also in a space of time where folks need to start taking responsibility for their actions. One, look at the effects of climate change right now happening because of a lot of actions happening in one side and no responsibility being taken by those that are actually causing a lot of this trouble. It's the same thing. Communication is powerful. And we've continued to say something with that singular focus of pleasing a certain person because you want a certain action from them. You want money most of the time. And that has really, really dented how a certain society is seen, mostly those of us that they define as the global south. It has affected, therefore, our relationships. It has affected our geopolitics, and so that is why I would say that really it is time for us to think about it from a moral standpoint. We just have to start doing better and doing good.
It's been covered very well. I mean, particularly for an operational organisation like Care International, we have as one of our key kind of programme principles, do no harm. And as any humanitarian organisation across the sector, and I think that is something that until only recently we've or in the last few years, we've been thinking, well, what does that actually mean in terms of communications? And it was particularly apparent, and I think both Victor and Chilande have touched on this, is, we were becoming very concerned, for example, about how, human rights issues, different countries were being portrayed and stereotyped, and particularly kind of in ways that were weaponizing a political agenda, and particularly by sort of far-right conservative, and we've seen, that rise of the kind of the populism and the far-right sort of narrative and agenda, which has become a lot more mainstream in some contexts. So, for example, you would see sort of a group of refugees which would be placed up on a poster, and this sort of language of the swarm is coming was this sort of threatening kind of narrative that has been again weaponized, I think, by some hard right conservative groups. And yet when we look at some of our own materials, we're showing kind of similar imagery, but with a very different message, or we're trying to convey a very different message. And so we started to ask questions around, well, how much are we actually feeding into, unintentionally feeding into a narrative which is incredibly harmful and has huge repercussions, which I think Victor and Chilande have just touched on really beautifully. So for us, it is about really thinking about that do no harm programmatic principle and applying it to communications. And what does that mean? And what is it that we're presenting to the world, and how do we do it in a way that is ensuring we're not causing anybody harm? And that can be from a sort of a mass market appeal right down to how you have an informed consent discussion with somebody who you would like to photograph as part of that mass market appeal. Is that informed consent process giving them the full rights, the full agency, the full understanding of what that process is, as well as the ability to say, well, actually, I would like to revoke that at some point in the future because my security situation may change. So it's absolutely part of a really important imperative around ensuring that nothing that we do in the public space is going to cause anybody any harm, directly or indirectly.
Are there any barriers that each of you has faced when trying to tell these stories more respectfully?
I can't neglect my own personal barrier. There has been a process for me of addressing and accepting my own bias as a white person sitting in the global north. And that's been a really important journey that, I've needed to personally go on and will continue to go on. So, I think that that's almost the first step is accepting bias, accepting internalized racism, accepting, these issues which can be personally quite challenging, but very important. And that's part of the journey. I think in terms of, there's often a debate, I think, around, and I think we'll come into this maybe in a bit more detail later, but around, the sort of tension between the business case and the moral case. So, we know that, the types of people that may give to organisations such as CARE or other sort of humanitarian organisations may not be doing the work, or may not sort of, and the reality is that there is a population that is still, responding to a sort of very needs-based type approach where you have a very short window of opportunity to capture their attention. That's within a wider context of where, funding for humanitarian work is decreasing. The economic situation globally is challenging, and the sort of so there are sort of business challenges, which of course are going to be, have to be part of the conversation, and you have to accept the business reality around that. But it is about, I think, those are the most challenging things. So I think, most people that I have worked with at CARE are sort of, they totally get the moral imperative, but it's also, well, what are we willing in terms of funding in order to test different approaches? What are we willing to change? And, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is often that kind of the business case, the moral case, and trying to find that balance between the two. And arguably, I don't think it needs to be one or the other, but I think that those are usually where the questions come up.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. Chilande, what has been your experience like? Are there any barriers on your end?
I'll give you a recent story that pains me today, to date. We were in the process of just trying to come up with a strategic plan for a certain organization. And part of that was just to collect all the stories of change that had happened over time and to collect more stories around the issues that they wanted to address, and present them out there to sort of back up their rationale for what it is they wanted to do. It was very painful to sit in a meeting with um, funders, the initial funders that this organization had that were also, that were not indigenous they're not from Kenya. These funders were from a European country, and to sit in there and have them throw daggers at this director and tell her straight up, that's not the story that you told me at the beginning. And this beginning that they're talking about was, let's say, 5 years prior to this. This was their first strategic planning process. And so they're putting forward their stories. And this one is saying, no, 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 that's not the story that you sold me. That's not why I give you money. And so I'm sitting there getting confused and wondering, what do you mean that's not this? That's her story. This is an organization that is founded on a real lived experience. And somebody's telling you about the experience and you're saying, no, 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 that's not good enough. And so when I was insisting and saying, folks, we have to stay true to the story, we have to remain authentic. This is the story that we want to put out there. This is the narrative that they want for their organization. And having to get into this back and forth, and they had to fly in more people to come and deal with this Kenyan lady who doesn't seem to understand that this is not fundable. This story is not fundable. So you need to change. And I'll tell you, that was a very painful process that led to this organization losing 80% of their funding, because I said to her, look, your story is too important for it to be watered down because somebody doesn't like your story. It is all right. We will go back to the drawing board. We will get started once again because we cannot change to suit a certain, funding narrative. So those kinds of biases, those kinds of, it's very difficult, and also finding myself constantly in a situation where we have to always rationalize and explain ourselves why this story is important and not that one. It gets very tiring. The other just small one that I will mention is that even in trying to move forward and trying to get their stories known. Somebody the other day was saying, and it was interesting. I was speaking to my father, who tends to have quite some wisdom, and I was saying to him, I'm working with these colleagues, international colleagues, and they keep going on and on about how Africans, we are verbose. We explain and over-explain. You can't just say something in a short period. And he gave me some very interesting perspective, and he said, mom, he calls me his mom, we do you know why Africans do that? Is because ever since we were colonized, we've had to always be on our defense. We've always had to over explain ourselves. Why were you found in this room and not that room? Why are you on this road and not there? Where is your ID? So we are constantly having to come up with stories to explain ourselves, and we are always being told, are you sure that's the right thing? Growing up with our parents, are you sure you did not steal? And then, it's so and so, so that's been our story that has been passed down over time. And so we are used to always speaking a lot. And that speaks to when I'm trying to explain to folks, I know I also get frustrated when somebody goes on, but understand why and give them some grace, right? And allow them to communicate in the way that they best know how to communicate. So that for me, those kinds of biases that come from cultural differences, has been one of the biggest barriers that I face recently. If I'm to go personal,
Oh my God, Chilande. Victor and I were just nodding our heads
right?
because we can so relate to that. Absolutely. Victor, to you now.
I agree with everything that's been said, really. I've worked across two organizations on this subject of respectful storytelling. And so I tend to categorize my the concerns, the feedback I get from organizations, like in two categories. One is the interpersonal and the more subtle, kind of pushback, which really is about unconscious biases and microaggressions and the way the ways people have been used to operating in the past, and the narratives that they have being exposed to, and so it comes in the way, it gets in the way, really. And Claire made allusions to this. Chilande has also spoken about this, so it's quite clear. Now, the other category for me would be what I see as the organizational, um, the feedback I get, like from institutions and organizations that we try to influence in this space with regards to respective storytelling. One of the things that stands out for me is that sometimes organizations feel, and rightly so, that they are not sufficiently equipped to take action even when they are persuaded about the need to. And so they sometimes do not have the tools to make categorical decisions and changes, or they do not have sufficient knowledge of what to do. There's also some concern around sustainability of new practices and approaches. It's usually a very big concern for organizations. This could entail things like more mainstreaming respective storytelling could entail more funding, right? It could entail more innovative ways of funding. It could entail new streams of funding. And it could also entail ad hoc or permanent structural changes in organizations, which some organizations are just not prepared, to confront. And this could be quite tasking and demanding for organizations. Projecting messages in a different way, in a more respectful, in a more balanced, in a more ethical way, could also earn some organizations resistance and pushback by their traditional audiences. And this is something that we oftentimes do not pay attention to. Organizations have got loyalties and alliances and audiences that, love the way that they have operated over time. And so taking up these changes could appear a little bit disruptive. And to be fair to organizations, there's a need to acknowledge the fact that they are going to have to pass through some transitional and evolutionary processes internally, right? And not all organizations are as nimble and as flexible, to make those hard decisions internally. So these are some of the things that I've seen, coming from an organizational sort of perspective. And I think it's just fair that we acknowledge the fact that it's not a stroll in the park. It's not going to be very easy for organizations to take on these new approaches. And basically, these are some of the feedback that I see structurally from organizations. And there's also something I think will be very important to mention here, which is that the resistance I have from the feedback I've received from organizations, resistance oftentimes come from decision makers or decision making stakeholders within those organizations, as against the staff who are meant to implement programs and run with programs. So those that come up with strategies and decisions at the top level, either at the management level or senior leadership level, there's usually that resistance and pushback at that level, much more than you have further down, the organization's hierarchy. And funding and mainstreaming the practices within an organization is usually a huge challenge. Communication and program staff who deal with implementation are not so much of the problem. There are a couple of recommendations to tackle this, but maybe we'll come to that at some point in the line of questioning. But really, these are some of the feedback I have seen across the different organizations I've worked with and we've tried to influence.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for what I've heard. I think for me, one of the areas or barriers is the question of urgency and time. Assuming you're working in an industry where say there's a humanitarian crisis or refugees need to be, taken to a safe place. Or so there's the urgency, and time and urgency become a barrier to telling these stories in a way that's more respectful, right? And because you want the call of actions quickly, and I think it's the dilemma that Claire, you I think had hinted on in terms of you talked about business realities. In a way, it ties into that. How do we navigate? And I think even as we think about, some of these are the challenges. Thinking thinking of an organization that is really time bound, and they really have to tell these stories, to have to get these stories out quickly and urgently. How then do you tell these stories in that context? I don't know whether you have pieces of advice for anyone in, maybe in that space. How do you deal with that? Claire, perhaps I'd like to hear a little bit about that, and how maybe, say, for example, you in that position, you would handle that, especially in the context of humanitarian crisis.
It's a great question, and I'm not sure we've got it completely right, because we've been really tightening up around things like informed consent, which I touched on earlier. And I always say, if you're having that conversation and it only takes a minute, you're not having an informed consent conversation, right? So that should be a process that can take up to half an hour to really be fully informed. Now, in a humanitarian, fast evolving humanitarian situation, which I think you were just describing, that's often it's not possible to do that. For COVID, for example, we couldn't get forms signed because you had to keep 6 distance away, and so there has to be some kind of you have to sort of think sometimes in slightly different ways. And one of the questions I think that we ask is, if this was an image or portrayal of your mother, your sister, your son, or your brother, would you be comfortable with doing, sharing this with the world? Is it, and I think it is about trying to really think about that connection piece, that human to human connection piece. And we know that in humanitarian emergencies, people are often quite keen that the world is seeing what is happening. So I think that, there has to be that level of understanding as well. But it is about thinking about different factors around dignity and empowerment, for example. And often people can be in very undignified situations, such as a humanitarian emergency, but that doesn't mean to say you can't portray them in a way that is empowered. So there's a lot of different, I think that, and I'll talk about this a little later, but there's a lot of things that can go into a policy document. And there are some things where you just have to use your human heart and your common sense and think about what is the most respectful and dignified way of bearing witness, which is a role that we do have, but in a way that is dignified and practical to that business reality. So there's a lot of factors that need to come into that, a lot of questions that need to be asked.
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. Chilande, I saw you're taking notes. I'm assuming you're also, you wanted to answer some of these questions.
I'm underscoring. I mean, in my mind, I'm just underscoring what Claire is saying, because in those types of situations that we often find ourselves in that moment, it becomes about instinct, right? You're acting on instinct, and that is driven very much by the values that you already have. And in that emergency situation, people are acting on common sense. And so a lot of times when I'm preparing with folks here, we are always saying, first and foremost, we know that I don't know if we can continue to say that this is kind of an emergency in that sense, like it's unprecedented, because a lot of these crises that happen are things that have been happening over time. It's just that because we are always in a project mindset, we always imagine, right, we've dealt with that hurricane, right, we've dealt with that, famine, but we see these things are coming, right? We know that these things could come. And organizations don't do enough of these scenarios planning, forward-thinking planning to prepare themselves in a way that allows them to actually avoid some of those mistakes. There's some photographs that have been going out. Kenya, as you know, right now we are having famine, right, in Northeast Africa, in Northeast. And so when I see, somebody sent me some very questionable photographs the other day to donate food, and I was very upset. And I said to them, what are you doing? Oh, we just took the first photographs that we could take in that moment because we needed to do this appeal. And I said, no, we've been doing this. There's a cycle, right? So put in the work beforehand to make sure you have something that can anchor you as you collect fresh information. There's no point of going down an unethical route just because this has happened. The incident has happened, but it's not necessarily unprecedented. It's not an emergency. And it's because we don't think enough about our communications and prepare ourselves for it, but not just the policies, as Claire was saying, prepare our people to think in the way that you just described so well, Claire. How would I feel if this was me? Again, we were talking with a colleague recently, and she was saying to me, when they come to some of our villages, this lady in Malawi, when they come to our villages and they take random photographs of people sitting in the village, of course they'll find us in tatters and with our ashen legs and knees because our parents have kicked you out of the house to go and play as they prepare for dinner, right? So you're not in your what we call the Sunday best. Of course, you're not dressed in your best clothing, and that's the photograph that they're going to tell you. But that's not the narrative, right? If we can avoid as much as possible being this reactive, I think we can begin to get there and really investing in establishing the right values in our people that are putting out these stories. So I was just getting excited to hear that Claire articulated that way. That's why you were seeing me taking notes very furiously.
No, thanks for sharing that. Victor, I want you to add a little twist to that question. You talked about leaders and leadership. How would you engage them in addressing some of these issues? And you've talked about some of the feedback you've received from different organizations and some. What advice would you give these leaders, or what strategies? Claire, of course, Chilande has talked about scenario planning as one of them. But what are some of the other, pieces of advice you would do, give as you engage with the leadership?
Okay, so thank you so much. I mean, it's been so wonderfully articulated. I love this question so much. But I just wanted to, before I respond to the other part of the question, which you just asked now, let me also touch a little bit on what has been said already, which is that I may not necessarily be a communication expert and understand the context that communication people face. Especially in the example you gave, which is like a humanitarian situation, and so there's a whole lot that we do not know about. But what I see from experience and from feedback and interactions, what I hear oftentimes is that you oftentimes find yourself in situations where you have to act on impulse, and you have to sort of make quick decisions about what to do, right? When you're putting out your messages, you're capturing stories real time, and you're trying to put out messages in real time and all of that. It's true. But here's one thing: when you act on impulse, what you're simply doing is you're going back and reflecting what values you have imbibed over time. That's what impulsive and reflexive action does. And so when you put in on the spot, you put in those situations where you have to make very quick decisions, you're simply going to go back and pull out from your reservoir of values that you have imbibed over time, narratives that you have been exposed to over time. It reflects in those quick decisions that you make. And so I think this brings me to the point of making respective storytelling a consciousness, not just a concept that needs to be learned, right? It has to be imbibed. It has to be part of business as usual, so that when people find themselves in situations where quick decisions need to be made, either they find themselves in a program setting or they find themselves in an emergency situation or humanitarian situation where quick decisions have to be made, you are always sure that you've got some reservoir, you've got some foundation of respectful storytelling, you've got some quick rules of thumb that you can apply, right? And ensure that you are still on track with regards to that. So I think it needs to be brought to that point of becoming a consciousness. It needs to be people need to be sensitized to the point where it becomes a consciousness, it becomes a norm, it becomes a business as usual within the communication space. Now to the other twist of the question which you just added. um, Really, it's kind of difficult, and my experience has been, it's not been all rosy and very successful engaging senior stakeholders, especially when they have to balance what I'm saying with the organizational imperatives and all the other indicators that they have to think about before making programmatic decisions and all. But I think my approach has always been to present the need for new and ethical storytelling, ethical communication approaches as an imperative, as an inevitable approach if organizations are to be considered responsive to the contemporary concerns of the day. The landscape of funders is also evolving to one that is more socially aware. Our audiences are evolving to one that is more socially aware. So, on one hand, we're trying to keep tabs with our audiences. On one hand, we're trying to keep tabs with those who fund the programs that we carry out, right? And so, these two sets of stakeholders that we serve, we happen to find ourselves in the middle. But these two sets of stakeholders have become extremely socially aware, especially at an era like this. This is 2022. What has happened between the beginning of COVID in 2020 and now can pass for activities that would happen in an entire decade of 10 years, in the past. And so a lot is happening, a lot is evolving, a lot is shifting. This evolving landscape of funders need to be demonstrated to stakeholders as a justification to be more socially responsive with our communication approaches. So that has been my approach. Being ethical in our comms may not have immediate gains in terms of numbers, in terms of money, in terms of budget, but it definitely has long-term and net benefits for the image building and reputations of organizations. And this image building and reputation ultimately become assets to organizations in future when they want to get funding and in terms of their efforts to connect better with their audiences. And so, whilst we acknowledge that there are difficulties in making quick decisions right now about adopting these new approaches because you just can't see the gains, you just can't see the benefits immediately. But in the long run, you are building your organization into an organization that is more socially responsive. And that alone becomes an asset. That in itself becomes an asset for your future pursuits, both in connecting with your audiences and in pitching for more funding for your programs. And so that has been my approach, and I think it's been quite successful.
That's exactly what was my next question. How well are you doing with that sort of approach? And thank you for sharing that, because it really I was thinking about, we've talked about the moral case, we've talked about and Victor, thank you also for bringing that, and Claire as well, and Chilande, sort of the business imperative as well, to doing this and the challenges around that. And my question was, and Victor, in one way or the other, you address it, what case is enough? Is this the moral case enough? It doesn't seem like in and of itself is enough to actually push leaders, to sort of make decisions considering the business realities of the time. There's effectiveness, numbers, budgets, donors, and all these, things. But I liked what you've said, you build a consciousness that's embedded on values in a way that this becomes business as usual. And you also talked about the importance of, sort of long-term thinking, our long-term approaches compared to the short-term gains. Of course, which is a catch 2022, because we are not evaluated as communications people on our long-term success or the long-term brand equity, right? No, we are not evaluated on that. We are evaluated on the metrics of this year or this quarter. And I think I want to throw it to Claire and Chilande. Considering this is how we are evaluated, how then do you address that elephant in the room? Any one of you can go first.
Maybe you have more context from Care. Mine is a lot more general.
Yeah, just so I'm clear on the question, you're talking about how we evaluate ourselves in terms of holding ourselves accountable. Yeah, I think it's I mean, I really hear what Victor was saying around this being a long-term process, and I really believe in that, and I think that policies and guide notes and various other things have a place in some areas, but when you are dealing with an issue where you have the moral case and then you have the business case that we've talked about, and some part of that is also, he's always talking about what is in your sphere of control and what is outside of your sphere of control, often on this debate. And we have done a process at CARE where, in actual fact, the change. I think what we recognise is in order to sort of rethink how we're doing our storytelling in some of the ways that we've discussed previously on the call, it was actually more about behaviour change and cultural change, which I think you touched on, than, sort of putting in place a new policy or a guidance note, which nobody is particularly, nobody's in the right place to put in place anyway. So we actually started it. I'm not a big fan of policies and these sort of things anyway, as most of my colleagues can probably attest. So actually, the way we approached this was to really make it a very much a bottom-up discussion which started around 2019, in terms of just having a conversation about it. I think we positioned some ideas in my team, and again, I can't take credit for this. It was very much driven by 18 communicators across different countries and contexts who wanted to really think about, what could we be doing differently? And so we facilitated lots of different discussions around that, and over the process of about a year, we developed these, I call them the 6 seeds of change. They're the CARE global comms commitments, and they cover different things around, applying justice narratives, which I think we've discussed, investing in local talent, investing in local photographers, videographers. No one is going to tell that story better than them. It is around how we, the types of people we put forward as spokespeople. There's a whole, host of things. And this was very much a kind of, it was just a sort of a set of ideas that were kind of presented throughout our working group, which is about 300 odd folks. And I think that was it was the right way to go, because then it was a process of listening and learning. And rather than kind of coming in and saying, okay, this is going to be some new policy around X, Y, and Z, it was actually, and I think the point you made, Victor, about this being a process, this is a long time process. There's almost no end to this, because each step we sort of make, there is new learnings and new things that we're discovering around how different perspectives are seen across different regions, different parts of the world. So yeah, I would just say, in terms of, addressing how you address the elephant in the room, or how you kind of have these conversations, it is about making it very bottom up and trying to find the spaces. We bring translators in, trying to make sure that there are spaces where everybody can be talking to each other across different time zones, across different cultures and across different experiences, and feel a sense of co-creation around that change. And that has had huge value, I think, not just to how we are thinking about our communications, but also how we're working together as a big, diverse group of folks.
No, thank you so much, Claire, for sharing that. Absolutely. And I think what we've seen, like, for example, at Path, is we've embedded diversity, equity, and inclusion in all our work, and including how we communicate. And I think that's also important for organization. I think it was Victor who talked about values. And once that's embedded in your values, then it's not only the right thing to do, but it's good for business as well, right? And what we also realize is that the communication team can lead the way. Sometimes we don't have to wait for the CEO, to say yes or to approve. We can actually lead the way in communicating respectfully and ethically, and the others will follow. And what we did at Path, we developed a communication guidance around respectful storytelling, how the photography and all these things, and it's become part of a brand identity. Of course, sometimes we don't really fully live 100% to it, but we are leading the way in that regard and saying the leaders will follow, even when the budgets are constrained. We make it a conscious decision to use that as our guiding principle. We've lost Chilande. Hopefully, she'll be able to join us. And maybe to as we're getting to a close, I'd like to hear your perspective, Victor, as collaborators with with many NGOs. How do you manage app, or how do you manage your clients to advance ethical storytelling, and what is it like navigating those conversations, Victor?
Thank you so much. Just very quick one on the previous question, the last question, which is, I would like to say, or just to add that the moral concerns and the business concerns, they're not mutually exclusive. So you can have both, right? You can do the right thing, and that right thing can also be very good for business. I'm happy you made allusions to that. Claire has also made allusions to that. That has oftentimes been the misconception when conversations around respectful storytelling is being had. So sometimes the questions are framed in ways that suggest that you either have one or the other, or sometimes organizations understand or perceive it in ways that appears like they have to choose one or the other, but it doesn't have to be. But I'm happy that we're all on the same page on that. And to your question, really, we first of all, I think I'll start by saying that we are a narrative change organization, and so respectful and ethical storytelling aligns with our objectives. It aligns with our objectives. We allocate resources, and we will continue to allocate resources. We have allocated resources towards developing better tools for storytelling, like production of an ethical storytelling handbook, helping development institutions mainstream and embed these practices within their organizations, and so on. We do that, and so it aligns very much with our perspectives, with our mission and our objectives as an institution. Um, we give grants to organizations developing more tools and creating better access to these tools, or dismantling the obstacles to accessing these tools. And the target audiences have oftentimes been communication experts, uh, communication practitioners, whether they're journalists or editors, and even students. I give you an example. We partnered with Thompson Foundation for a groundbreaking self-paced open source digital course, right? So the reason we made it open source, and the reason it was very attractive to us, is that we don't want this conversation to exist just within the organizations we are able to have direct engagement with, and the impact of our influence, you know we want it to transcend these organizations. So it's open source, it's right there online. Journalists, freelancers can have access to it. It's a huge tool, a huge reservoir of resources that shouldn't just exist between institutions that African No Filter has targeted and are having primary and direct engagement with. And so these are some of the things that we do, and these are some of the ways we sort of influence NGOs and sort of manage our clients and advance the subject, within that space. It's been quite difficult navigating these conversations, but I think innovative things like partnering with institutions um, who are who you can leverage on their networks, you can leverage on their expertise, right? It's one objective, but there are many of us who are approaching that objective from different perspectives. And so the more we partner with institutions, the more we provide those who can provide support, those who can provide technical expertise, those who can provide funding, we can all come together and just synergize. And the result of that synergy is what I've just explained to you about the course that came about, that has been put online. It's open source, everybody has access to it, and journalists and freelancers are having access, and then it's influencing their thoughts and all of that. Now, in addition to that, we are also partnering with an institution called DGEMI. Some people call it DGEMI, but it's DGEMI, I call it. So what they are meant to do is to gamify our ethical storytelling handbook, right? And so gamifying the ethical storytelling handbook takes it away from um, this mysterious esoteric subject to something that is very fun to engage with, right? It is very accessible and fun to engage with. And then we circulate it to freelancers, journalists, and development institutions who put out a lot of communication about their impact in Africa, right? So staff of development institutions will take on this course, but they won't see it as an additional layer of making their lives difficult, right? But they will see it as something fun to engage with. Students can also engage with it because it's like a game. It's like a game. So these are innovative ways of breaking down the barriers and breaking down access to these things. The conversations should not just exist within us and the institutions we engage with, but the conversation should go far and wide. And the more the conversation gets circulated, we want it to be embraced by all and sundry. And we keep constantly thinking about ways of providing support to organizations that are coming up with innovative ways of driving the message of respectful storytelling. So it's a
Thank
message,
you,
right?
Victor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. I know you're passionate. Claire, maybe to you, you work at a big organization, Care International. How can organizations as big as Care create a culture of ethical or respectful storytelling? What are some of the steps they need to do?
Yeah, and it's such a great question. And I think, touching on what was mentioned earlier around values and really leaning into that, at Care, we have a very, our staff are very values driven, very passionate, very focused on change and doing the right and ethical thing. So, that culture exists. And I think it is about how you tap into that. So I talked a little previously around the importance of listening and having conversations and dialogues over sort of imposing kind of top-down processes, and I think this is certainly true. So for just expanding on those, I think there's a couple of things that we have done that have been particularly impactful. And so as part of the communications commitments, we committed to doing an audit of our image database, so a very practical thing I think people can do. And it has, again, just been, we did the first one. We had a sort of quite basic methodology, which was looking at, how many images were taken by white men from the global north, how many were being taken by, how many were taking pictures of women. I mean, Care has a very strong focus on gender and gender justice. We looked at how many images are having consent and so on and so forth. So some quite sort of qualitative analysis, but also what we introduced just in our last audit was more sort of subjective questions around, is this image dignified? Is it empowering? Is it does it represent the vision that we have as an organization? And what I think is so interesting from that is that we've been able to see, and I think we talked a bit about accountability and discussing what that can look like in an organization. By doing these audits, we're able to compare to where we were sort of 2 years ago, and we see that we've seen like a threefold increase over a 2-year period in terms of who's taking the image. So much more images being taken by women, majority of whom are national to the context that the image is being taken. But what has also been really interesting is, and we use a group of about 30 volunteers from all different regions, Middle East, Africa, Europe, all over the world, come in and help us do this analysis. And on the subjective questions, where we get often two people looking at the same image, there was a real divide in terms of, there was more agreement around things that were clearly empowering, but it was really hard to see that kind of agreement around things that may be a little bit more grey, a bit more of a borderline question. So that beautifully brings out a lovely dialogue and debate we can have around subjective bias and who is it we need to be thinking about when we do the next audit, in terms of, could we be talking to our partners? Could we be talking to our program participants around some of this? So again, it's about developing tools that are, for us, that have been, the audit has been a really great tool to sort of have a look at how we're progressing on the one side, but also as a way of re-stimulating and keeping the conversation alive and keeping people discussing and debating. and thinking about this journey that we're on. So that would be one thing. The second thing I think is about sector-wide change. So as part, okay, it's basically come together. You know, we've become part of the Pledge for Change process, which you can Google and find out more about. And that's us with 5 other NGOs. And I think, you know, working across, you know, a broader sector and bringing wider players into the discussion and the debate is really powerful as well. And it helps you to move forward together rather than feeling like you're moving alone.
Yes, absolutely. So that's the final question for everyone. One single piece of advice you will give to someone who wants to better tell their stories ethically or convince leadership. What is the one piece of advice you would give them? We could start with Victor, then Claire, and then hopefully Chilande.
Well, one piece of advice which goes to everyone really is to put ethics at the center of storytelling. To put ethics at the center of storytelling, and this could take several forms. You know, but one of the key things to bear in mind is always to use ethical guidelines and understanding informed consent correctly, understanding the local context, investing time in projects, investing time in understanding the local context. They're very important. Investing in people, challenging unequal power relations, um, basically putting ethics at the center of storytelling, and it cuts across both management and implementation staff, your audiences, and your funding stakeholders. Really putting ethics at the very center, at the heart of storytelling is key.
Thank you, Victor. Claire?
I would say don't start with your leaders. Start with the folks who are on the ground telling the stories. Make it a bottom-up approach, and then when you get beautiful impact from that story, you will have made your case to your leadership, and they will not be able to deny that process. So I would always say, start with the folks that are already on your side and are interested and engaged in getting involved.
Absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. Chilande, can you hear us?
Now I can. I'm so sorry.
It-
I missed
It's
I
okay.
missed the best parts.
No, the best part is now the one that you're here. What is the one single piece of advice you will give to someone who wants to start or tell their, to tell their stories ethically? What's the single piece of advice you give them?
I'm a big proponent of making sure that the right people are at the table to start any form of dialogue. To get to ethical storytelling, we must go into it not blindly. We must go into it understanding that there is wounds and pains from the past that have led us to actually even crafting a term like ethical storytelling, which shouldn't be the case. So we start by acknowledging those that have happened in the past, understanding where we are at in the present, and co-designing what the future needs to look like. So I would strongly advocate for more and more multi-stakeholder engagement to build understanding, to build empathy, to build appreciation of the beauty and diversity of all of our narratives, and then come together to craft something that can take us forward progressively, where nobody is left out of the table, but more importantly, nobody is hurt and everybody is honored in how we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for this wonderful, engaging conversation. I mean, time just stops when you're having a good time, right? So thank you so much. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Chilande, for your wonderful insights. I'd like now to bring in Flavi and Liz for the next steps. Thank you very much. Asante from me.
Thank you. This was wonderful.